Episode 53, Physicist, Biotech Entrepreneur, and Organizational Behavioral Guru, Safi Bahcall. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Safi Bahcall. Safi received his BA in physics from Harvard and his PhD from Stanford. He co-founded Synta Pharmaceuticals, a biotechnology company developing new drugs for cancer. He led its IPO and served as its CEO for 13 years. In 2008, he was named Ernst & Young New England Biotechnology Entrepreneur of the Year. In 2011, he served on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Safi is also the author of Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. The book was selected by Malcolm Gladwell, Dan Pink, Susan Cain, and Adam Grant for the Next Big Idea Club. Safi, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
So before we dive into the book, I want to get a little bit of a snapshot of you. Your father was a physicist. Your mother was an astrophysicist. So I guess not a huge surprise that you studied physics. So I was curious if your parents' work just inspired you, or were they really pushing you to go in that direction, sort of follow in that high academia footstep?
Well, both my parents were astronomers, astrophysicists. And so I became kind of the black sheep rebel going into theoretical particle physics. I know it doesn't sound very rebellious, but it is pretty different. If anything, I would say my father encouraged me to try other things and do different things. They certainly instilled a love of truth and a love of higher purpose, and they didn't know anything about the business world and didn't find that particularly interesting or important, which is probably why I followed that path for the first 30 or so years. And I remember when I came back and told them, I'm pretty curious about stuff outside of a university. I was by the time 30 years old, and I had a career going. I'd gotten a faculty position, and I said, I'm kind of curious. I have this suspicion that 99+% of the world, they're not theoretical physicists. And I'm kind of curious what they do for a living. I've never worn a suit. I've never been in an office building. I don't even know what it's about.
So you were actually going down the path of academia.
I was undergraduate, then a graduate student, then a postdoc, and applied for faculty positions, got a faculty position.
So was there something about it that, because obviously, you got your PhD, your BA in physics and top institutions in the world. I assume, and maybe it's a false assumption, that it was interesting to you. You were passionate about it. You liked thinking about these topics and researching it. So what happened when you got to that faculty role?
Well, I got the faculty job, but for me, it was more about, and I absolutely loved what I was doing. But for me, kind of one consistent thing through all the different turns that I've had in career or things that I've pursued is that I just love learning. I get a little bit bored when the learning curve plateaus. I like to say in physics geek language, I couple to the derivative, which means when the slope of learning is high, I'm really excited. And when the slope of learning is low, I get a little less interested. So I love the challenge of the beginning when I was studying this kind of science or that kind of science, or I moved between different fields of science or within physics. And I love that starting at the bottom of the mountain and fighting your way up until you really understand what's around you. You're almost an imposter in this new world, and then you're learning about it, and then things become clearer and clearer, and you understand the language, and you can all of a sudden see around you. Around when I was about in my late 20s or early 30s, I started to begin to wonder, I see a lot of people in office buildings. What do they do? I had a girlfriend at the time who worked in an office building. She was a paralegal. And I said, hey, could you take me to your office building so I could ask
It
people?
seems like you're a stranger in a strange land. Like, what's this
Yes.
office building?
What is this office building thing? And what are these funny things that people wear around their necks that are tied? Like, could you take me? I was like, sort of like an anthropologist. And I remember going, and it was a Friday afternoon. And she worked actually at a very well-known law firm in Silicon Valley. I was at Stanford at the time. And I remember asking that. She said, well, why don't you come Friday afternoon where we have this sort of little drinks at the office and people are just standing around and you can chat with them and mingle. And I said, okay, that sounds good. And so I went. People were sort of lined up and they were hanging out and they had a little drink. And I said, well, what do you do? And they sort of explained, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. And then I said, well, are you happy? Do you enjoy it? And I probably asked 15 people, and 15 out of 15 said no. And I was like, well, that's the end of this whole business world thing. I'm done.
back to school.
Back to the lab. Well, that was that. That's my experiment. I'm done. So actually, in fact, I did persist for a few more years in science and academia, but I did grow curious. And I remember when I, talked to people who had made a transition to something at the time, it was called McKinsey Management Consulting. I'd never heard of them, but I saw that there were a few people who had done that, and they'd taken some physicists. And the people who I talked to who had done that would describe it as sort of like puzzle solving, but in a different world. And science and physics is really about puzzle solving and looking for patterns and having a mystery about how the world works and trying to crack that mystery. And they said that, well, this is the same thing, except in a different setting. In the business world, you're giving, should you acquire this thing? Should you do this? When companies succeed or fail, what are some common patterns? And how do we go more towards the former and less towards the latter? And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. But I remember telling my parents one time, I went back home. My parents are at Princeton, and going back home to Princeton and telling them that, I think I'm going to try this business thing for a while. And I remember there was some kind of cocktail reception. I think a friend was getting married, and there was a sort of reception. And I was actually standing behind them, and they were chatting with some family friends, and they didn't know that I was right behind them. And I remember someone asking my mom, what's Safi doing now? And I remember her saying, describing it like it's a fad. She said, well, he has this great career, and he's got this faculty thing, and he was a postdoc here. He's exploring this business world, but I'm sure he's going to come back. It was sort of maybe like parents, if you announce a change in sexual orientation or something, he's exploring.
Right. You're going to the Peace Corps for a year and you're trying to find yourself.
It's just temporary.
Right,
he's really going to come back to the faith and to the fold.
Right. I think denial is like one of the first phases of grieving. So look, I mean, you went to McKinsey and you were there for a few years. And next thing you know, just to sort of fast forward the tape, you decide to start this biotech company. And I mean, you're obviously a brilliant guy, but the world of astrophysics and the world of biotech, very different fields. So I want to hear about that journey. Why did you decide to start a company? What inspired you? What was it all about?
Well, I started to think about what really got me excited and what mattered to me. And I think as you get a little bit old, and you apply to college, you very often people go on a path that the world expects them to without pausing to say, why am I doing this? And, you're in high school, you apply to the best colleges, you're in colleges, you try to get into the best grad schools or get the best internships or get the best jobs you can. And there you try to rise up. And then at some point you say, well, why, what really excites me? And, I was fortunate that I really did enjoy and love basic science and basic puzzle solving and mysteries and truth. But I realized I wanted to do more. And in McKinsey, I was learning more about the world. And it's sort of like a halfway house for academics. They sort of take these very sheltered academics who've grown up in a university, and before they set you loose upon the world, it's this little stop where they teach you, well, here's how the real world works, and here's the language people use in the real world. And then you get a little bit of induction into that world. But I decided that what really turned me on was doing something more than just my own career resume or my own papers or my own ideas. It would be nice to do something that could change how people functioned in the world, that could make a difference, and in particular, the biomedical world. So I was incredibly excited by all the stuff that was changing, and I had a sense that this would be very important and more satisfying than the technology world, which is sort of felt to me like building better and faster gadgets. This was really about, my father was sick, and I thought, how amazing would it feel if I could do something that could contribute to giving people more time on earth with their loved ones. That just felt incredibly powerful and moving and inspiring to me. If I could wake up every morning and think that that's what I'm working for. And that's more important, or felt more important to me than, writing another paper or building up your resume. If you could do that, if you could contribute in some way to giving people more time on earth with their loved ones. And so that's kind of why I made the transition into the biomedical world.
So what was the startup idea? What was the big idea? How are you going to help people live longer?
So I got the sense at the time that there was a pretty big gap between folks at university, scientists at university, researchers at hospitals or university, and the people who were funding them, whether on Wall Street or venture capitalists. And that gap has closed 20, 25 years later. But at the time, the people funding early stage biotechnology and scientists in the labs often weren't well trained in science. And that could lead to a lot of frustration. So when I talked to other scientists at universities, I would talk to them scientist to scientist, and they had, I wasn't a biologist or a chemist. I was trained as a physicist. And to them, that's sort of like I was coming from Mars. What's this guy who's a physicist in my, office talking to me about biology? And that was sort of interesting for them, but and they found that fun. And they found that a lot more fun and interesting and engaging, I think, often than talking to typical venture capitalist or typical Wall Street investors. Like I've said, 20 years later, that's changed. Most of investors are now MDs or PhDs, but back then it was a little more uncommon. And I thought, well, there's an opportunity for me to bridge these two worlds, because I had spent quite a bit of time by then on a trading floor inside investment banks, and I found that I was pretty good on talking on the one hand to traders and investors in language that they understood, and then I was pretty good at talking to scientists in language that they understood, and I could bridge those two worlds, and in the process, try to build something new and bring some of these ideas out of the lab. And that's what inspired me to leave and try to bridge those two worlds.
Okay, so you're bridging the worlds by focusing on what? What are you solving? Are you solving a disease? Is this about cancer?
I spent about 6 months going to different universities and talking to different researchers about what they were working on and what they had in the lab that they thought was really exciting and seemed to be stuck in the lab. And they really wanted to see it get out to the world. So when I left McKinsey and went to go start in the biomedical world, I didn't have a clear sense I want to work in disease X or project Y. I knew that we ended up starting a biotech company focused on cancer drugs. But at the time, I didn't know for sure that that's where I wanted to go. I ended up talking to a bunch of folks at universities, and it was clear that there were some projects in treating cancer that were stuck in the labs, and I wanted to be part of getting them out of the labs and getting them into patients and seeing if they could work. And so that's where we went, into cancer drugs.
So at some point along the way, you must have done enough research on this and gotten enough traction to be able to take this company public. Safi, most entrepreneurs dream about that, taking a company public, from scratch. Very few ever manage to get there. So when you're going from the world of a very, closely held private company to a world of reporting numbers to Wall Street, managing outside investors, handling public scrutiny, all of that. I mean, you're an academic turned biotech entrepreneur, CEO. What was that experience like? What was that transition like for you?
Well, the first few years of anything is you feel like an imposter, or at least I do. But I was used to that. I had moved between fields a bunch of times. The first week I started at McKinsey, and they throw you into a giant company, and it's like being thrown into a pool and saying swim. So you have to learn how to swim. I remember when I showed up for my first interview on Wall Street, in McKinsey, someone had coached me on what do you wear. I said, oh, you need to wear a suit. And I said, well, where do you buy these things? He said,
in one of those buildings.
And I said, well, they pointed me to a store, and I went to that store, and I said, oh my God, look at these clothes. I'm going to spend this huge amount of money and I'm going to look like phenomenal. And the store was called Men's Warehouse. And I spent like $150. And for me, that was like, 30 burritos. Like, that was a lot of money at the
That's a lot
time.
of burritos. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is a ton. I'm going to look like $1,000,000. And I remember getting in a plane and I had my awesome Men's Warehouse suit. And I'm like, this is going to be great. And I'm walking up Park Avenue for this meeting. I forgot, or I didn't realize that people have these fancy coats in New York, with these blue cashmere or whatever. So I had my old beat up ski jacket around this fancy Men's Warehouse suit. And I was like, I completely stood out. Like I looked like a homeless guy walking down the street. So you always feel like an imposter in the beginning. But I like that feeling because you know that you're going to learn very fast. And I was fortunate to be surrounded by people who were very experienced in public markets. And we, from the beginning, tried to run it like a pretty sophisticated, financial operation where we had pretty careful auditing, pretty tight controls, pretty good finance in place. We were trying to report in a very orderly, organized way so that we were in good shape. And we did that within the first few years so that the transition to public didn't, felt pretty smooth. It was consistent with how we'd been running the company the previous few years.
So you talked earlier about your love of learning, right? Taking on new challenges, climbing the mountain. So when you go from a world of academia into, when I say a foreign world, you didn't even know, what's inside the buildings, those buildings over there. I mean, here you are now in business as a leader in a public company. You've never even been in business, let alone run a company before. You've never been in biotech before. I mean, all of these things are new for you. You've never gone through an FDA regulatory process, et cetera, et cetera. So when you jump into a foreign world and it's a very steep learning curve, is there some sort of playbook? I mean, do you try to find mentors that have been there, done that? Do you read a lot of books? How do you go about getting really quickly into that flow so you feel like you can actually affect the outcome of whatever you're doing?
Number one, it starts with people. And so it certainly wasn't just me. And I think, I was very fortunate to surround myself with experts at all levels, both above me in the board of directors. I had a very talented, very experienced group of people, all of whom were, 10 or 20 years older than me, who took a great interest and had a great personal stake in trying to make a difference for cancer, and had a ton of business experience and a ton of finance experience. So it really wasn't about, my experience in these problems. I don't think people often who, if you haven't been in that particular role, it's hard to imagine, but your board of directors and you make the big decisions on, let's say, financing. And I had a board that was so well known and so experienced on Wall Street. It was pretty easy for me to just listen and sit back. And there wasn't a ton that I had to do. The professionals on the board were so good at that sort of thing that I could have a lot of confidence that their judgment about finance and banking. And we all had the same interest and the same agenda and the same higher purpose mission. So in some sense, that was easy because I was surrounded by great experts and, my job was to listen to them and ask good questions, but collect, it was a small group of us, very smart, very thoughtful, very experienced. And, I think because of that, we made some good decisions along the way. And the same thing with the internal team. You just find great people with an expertise in different areas and bring them together. So my job was more bridging the divide between people, because finance people don't naturally talk to biologists, don't naturally talk to chemists, don't naturally talk to medical people, don't naturally talk to manufacturing people. And so your job is more as a coach to try to bring these teams together and get everybody on the same page, resolve conflicts, and move forward. So it was less about my individual expertise or experience and more about assembling a group, whether board of directors or executive team, that could function well.
So where did the company eventually end up? Did it get its drug approved? Did it hit a wall? What's the final chapter of that story?
Oh, well, like a lot of biotechs, it was a roller coaster. And, there was, I think, a story I tell in the book. There was a guy who used to come over and advise us Sir James Black, a Nobel laureate, very well known for two big breakthroughs. And I remember one time telling him I was feeling pretty depressed because an early stage project in the lab had failed, and I had a lot of hopes for it. And he remember him leaning over one night, we were sharing some whiskey, and he patted my knee and said, Safi, it's not a good drug unless it's been killed 3 times. And that's certainly what happened to us. So the company went public in 2007. I left in 2014, and it merged a year or two later with another company. And some of the projects are still out there. I a little bit lost touch. Some of the projects are still out there in clinical trials. Nothing has been approved yet, but I haven't kept up since I left with the company.
All right, so I want to get into the book, but before we do, why a book? I mean, you could start another company. You could sit on boards. You could become a venture capitalist and invest in other companies. Other than people that make it big and then write memoirs, it's sort of an unusual approach to writing a book and then going out on the speaking tour and lecturing and advising, et cetera. So what was behind this new chapter of yours?
Well, I think it was like you were asking me before. As you say, it's pretty familiar. If you've been a CEO for 13 years and you've run a public company, it's not a very big community, the biotech community. You kind of all know each other. It's not that hard to go once you've done it and done all the mistakes and had all the hard learnings and all the punches in the stomach and then sort of figured it out. It's not hard to do it again. But then you go back and ask yourself, why? Why do I want to do it again? And for me, what I get turned on by is sort of a creative challenge and learning something completely new. And I had been giving this sort of fun talk as a hobby, 3,000 years of physics in 45 minutes. And I would, give the 8 biggest ideas in 3,000 years. And I just found I really enjoyed going back through history and teasing out patterns that were sort of surprising and figuring that out. It was like a different kind of puzzle. And I did that just as a side hobby, but it was really exercised a completely different part of my brain that had been kind of dormant for a long time. And I said, well, it's pretty rare to have the opportunity to try something new in your 40s, completely new from scratch in a world you don't know at all, and a skill set that you're really a beginner on, writing, and have the time and the opportunity to try to work on that skill set, which I love, try to become a better writer, become a better storyteller, and go back in history and do some real deep dives and uncover things about history or patterns of history that people think they know, but actually turn out what really happened was quite different. And then try to combine all them into a narrative thread connected by one idea. That was a pretty big challenge. And I said, that sounds like fun. Let me give it a shot. And I wrote an essay. And I thought, well, that was more fun than I expected. It was really pretty difficult to tie all these things together. And I thought that would be the end of it. Then I could go back to the real world. And turns out a book agent got a hold of it and said, wow, this is, and actually some author friends of mine who were pretty well known. I sent it to them. They said, wow, firstly, nobody writes 15,000 word essays anymore. That was 10 or 20 years. Now they're all like 280 characters. And secondly, it should be a book. And so an agent found me and said, well, I'll coach you into what a book is. And I'm like, okay.
Again, the book is called Loonshots: How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. So I guess, Safi, let's just start with the very beginning, which is, what is a loonshot?
Well, everybody knows what a moonshot is. It's a big goal, an exciting destination that everyone gets excited about. But if you look back through history, the ideas that transform science or business or even world history rarely arrive with blaring trumpets dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They're usually dismissed for years or decades, and their champions are written off as crazy. And since there wasn't a good word in the English language for that, I made one up.
So the pattern of sudden changes in the behavior of teams and companies, this is generally an enigma, or historically it's been an enigma for us. So that is the people that create these innovative breakthrough products that propel a company through hypergrowth can be the very same people later struggling to find a hit for years and years at a time. So, often we would just chalk that up to culture. That is, the culture must have somehow, taken a turn for the worse. But the premise of the book, or at least one of them, is you say it's not about culture, it's about structure, incentive structures in particular. So could you elaborate on that?
I think it comes back to kind of why I wrote the book. And you asked me that question and I answered. In some part, it was a fun creative challenge, but there was another reason. I was in a pretty small world, the biotech world, and I was in before that, another pretty small world, the academic science world. And I'd started this biotech company about 18 years ago. And not long after I started it, for developing cancer drugs, my father was diagnosed with a rare type of leukemia. And I figured, well, now I'm in the field, I can do something about this. And I did. I had access to all the latest science and technologies. But unfortunately, nothing I could do made any difference. And he died not much afterward. And then over the course of the next few years, as our company grew, I just noticed that all around me, buried inside the basements of whether it was tiny companies or large companies, buried inside the basements of these organizations were promising ideas that could have helped my father. And they were trapped inside there, not because any of the people were bad people, but because something strange happens when people come together into a group. And it doesn't matter very much what people try to, talk about culture, because everybody, almost every business book or every glossy magazine talks about culture all the time. But despite that, all these ideas were trapped in the basement. And it just felt to me like we were missing something important. And also, as a scientist, all this stuff about culture, well, I could understand it. And you want to obviously encourage your employees and celebrate victories rather than beat them and humiliate them. That's clearly a good idea. There was something, it was all pretty soft stuff, both on the underlying why and rationale for a lot of these things. We did a survey, and the companies with the highest returns to shareholders, the CEO drinks whiskey, so everybody should drink whiskey. So the underlying methodology felt a little soft for me, and I wanted something harder, and that's where this structure versus culture comes in. And you can think of it by analogy with, let's say, a glass of water. You have molecule, when the temperature is high, the molecules slosh around. That's the pattern of behavior. They're just running around free. And then when the temperature crosses 32 Fahrenheit, all of a sudden they line up rigidly, which is a very different pattern of behavior. But there's no CEO molecule saying, hey guys, just slosh around. It's 33. Oh no, wait a minute, it's 31. They just do it. And underlying that is temperature, and underlying that is two competing forces, one that wants to make them rigid and one that wants to make them run around and be free. And temperature controls the relative balance. And you can think of culture versus structure by analogy there. So culture you can think of as the patterns of behavior you see. For example, you have a political culture, or you have a very innovative culture. And everybody knows the difference between those two. Those are two patterns of behavior. Underlying that is, what do you reward or what do you celebrate inside the company? If you reward rank, in other words, you incentivize people by climbing up the ladder, you're going to get a very political culture. Everybody's going to be shooting down their neighbor and their neighbor's ideas to go ahead. On the other hand, if you don't reward rank at all, but reward intelligent risk-taking and ideas, you're going to get a very innovative culture. So you can think of culture as that pattern of behavior you see on the surface, and you can think of structure as what's underneath that's driving that pattern. And the reason it matters so much is that, as anybody knows who's been inside an organization, no amount of telling your employees to sing Kumbaya and hold hands and watch 2-hour movies about brotherhood is going to make much difference. No amount of yelling at your employees, hey, everybody innovate better, is going to make much difference. Just like yelling at the molecules in a block of ice, hey guys, could you just loosen up a little bit, is not going to melt that block of ice. But a small change in temperature can get the job done. A small change in temperature can melt steel. And so that's what I mean by culture versus structure. It's what you see on the surface, these patterns of behavior, and then trying to dig underneath to see what's driving these patterns of behavior.
So just to build on this stake versus rank, as you put them, so you talk about that organizations always have to balance these competing forces, if you will. When the groups are small, so that is when, let's say you're a startup, everyone's stake in the outcome is very high, in the sense that the outcome is binary, right? Either it works, the company gets bought, it goes public, everyone does really well financially. And if it fails, good luck getting a new job, right? You're kicked out on the street. And when you talk about rank, like you said, the titles and promotions, then suddenly it's more about how much I'm paid, how I'm viewed internally, et cetera, which happens as these companies mature and evolve. So there are these adverse behaviors that happen with company growth. If we want there to be less focus on individually motivated behaviors and more focus on driving what's in the best interest of the company, then what does one do? How do you optimize as the company starts to grow and behavioral patterns start to naturally evolve?
Yeah, I think the question that you're getting at is exactly what you said has been a mystery for a long time, almost 200 years. Why do groups suddenly change behavior? And when I get these calls from, many sort of well-known CEOs that went from 5 people to 5,000 or 50,000 or whatever, and they said, I can feel that happening here. When we were 5 people, everybody rolled up their sleeves and united around our crazy idea. And now they're getting very conservative, and they're focused on rank and career ladder. And we've clearly gone through that transition. And so what I'm doing the research for the book is tease out what are these forces. Like we talked about that glass of water, there are 2 forces. One that wants to make the molecules run around and be free, that's called entropy. And the other wants to lock them in place. That's called binding energy. Inside a company, whenever you organize people into a group with a mission and a reward system tied to that mission, you have instantly created 2 competing forces. One of them, as you say, is stake and outcome. When you're small, 10 people, your stake and outcome is huge. If you have a cancer drug and it works, everybody's a hero and a millionaire. And if it fails, you're unemployed. But the other is perks of rank. Where am I? What's my base salary? How do I go up the ladder? And when you're small, clearly the stake and outcome outweighs the perks of rank. Who cares if you're a team member or an associate? Everyone's going to do great if it works. But when you become very large, all of a sudden perks of rank start mattering more. And in between those 2, you can actually write down an equation, a typical form of incentives, and see exactly where they flip, like 32 Fahrenheit for a glass of water. You can find, the number of employees at which all of a sudden the incentive starts shifting from focusing on your project and rolling up the sleeves and everybody coming together, uniting around that to make it succeed, towards politics, lobbying your boss for promotions and that sort of thing. And if you've been inside a company, you can, as it's grown from small to large, you can start to, you can see that transition in terms of like what people talk about in the hallways. Are they talking about, how their project stumbled and how they can turn it around and how we can all save it? Or are they talking about how do I get that next job? How do I get, my career, et cetera, et cetera. So the trick is that where this becomes more than just sort of observational, but actually something you can use, is that once you understand this, you can begin to manage it. For example, when it snows overnight, you sprinkle salt on your sidewalk because that lowers the binding energy between molecules and makes them less sticky, more likely to slosh around. So when you wake up in the morning and you step on your sidewalk, you wet your shoe in a puddle rather than slip on ice and end up in the hospital. So once you understand that these are the 2 kind of forces or incentives on people, you can begin to redesign, begin to identify those small things like sprinkling salt that shift people to focusing more on projects and less on politics. The way you can imagine it is, let's say your job is to make coffee machines and you're, in a giant conglomerate of manufacturing, and you're way down in the middle. You're not at the CEO level. And you've worked 7 hours out of your 8-hour day, and you have to decide, how do you want to spend that last hour of your day? Do you want to spend it on polishing your coffee machine design? Or do you want to spend that last hour going to your boss's office and, kicking up your shoes and saying, oh, I'm just really hearing some terrific things about customers, about the way we're going, about the stuff you're doing. I didn't want to say, but Fred down the hall, just between you and me, they're really kind of complaining about his behavior, and they're really, the stuff he's working on, it's really, not working. Oh, and I, don't mention anything, but I hear he's having some trouble in his marriage too, just between you and me. In other words, politics.
Yeah.
So you want to identify what are those small things that shift you from wanting to spend that last hour of the day on projects to spending that last hour of the day on politics. And if you have an economic bent, that's called the marginal return on your incentives. And of course, we're just to keep it simple, we're talking about financial things, but you can apply it equally well to non-financial. So those are the things that you want to understand.
Well, hang on. So just to let's peel that back a little bit.
Yep.
Because I want to go from sort of the theoretical to some really, practical ideas. So let's take that person and the marginal hour, the marginal week, the marginal month. We don't want him or her spending their time in the boss's office. We want them focused on game-changing activity. So in that example, what kind of incentives? So we have that person more focused on the prize, if you will, the corporate prize, which are new products, new services to take to market, more revenue, company growth.
Yeah, so there's sort of 5 things that you can do. And I would start by saying this is half the battle. So the first half of the battle is identify those small changes in structure that encourage people to focus more on projects and less on politics. And there's 5 of those sort of more micro things, and I'll talk about that. But even at a bigger macro question, and when I talk with, I just spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. with national security agencies, national intelligence agencies, Defense Department on how we can do this. The even bigger problem is that there are these 2 phases, that there is a franchise phase where you focus on time, on budget, on spec, what works well in committee meetings. And there's sort of a loonshot phase where everybody rolls up their sleeves and nurtures the new crazy thing. And the even bigger problem is that there are these 2 phases, because a company needs to do both. You have to deliver on time, on budget, but you also have to stay ahead of your competitors. And in the case of a company, it's a matter of P&L. But so I was on a nuclear submarine recently, meeting with an admiral who was responsible for transforming the Navy, and that's a 500,000 person organization. So if you are hundreds of miles from shore, deep underwater, you don't want to start hearing a lot of clanking noises from your nuclear engine. That's your core. At the same time, you don't want to be surprised by a new kind of torpedo. That's your new. So for companies, these questions that we're talking about are a matter of P&L, but for national security agencies, defense agencies, it's a matter of life and death. And it really comes to a question of how do you balance the core and the new? So there's 2 big things that are takeaways. One is, what are these sort of micro incentive things that we can change, these 5 parameters that we can change inside companies to shift people's incentives. But the other thing is, you don't want everybody to be innovating all the time. You want some people making sure things that your nuclear engine doesn't make clanking noises, that you're on, that when you knock on a customer's door and say, here's your toaster, they don't say, a toaster? I ordered a television. So you want one set of people at your company, call them the soldiers or the developers or the manufacturers, focused on reducing risk. And you want another group focused, call them the artists or the designers or the engineers or the biologists, focused on maximizing intelligent risk-taking. So it's not, there's this mindset that innovation is always good. That's not the case. Innovation is about taking risks and failing a lot. You don't want someone working on a manufacturing parachutes to be experimenting and say, here you go, try this one. So one piece of the equation is identifying these sort of micro things that tilt you more towards innovation and more towards.
So what are those? Give me a few of those micro things.
For example, reducing what you might call return on politics. What do I mean by that? What is the likelihood that when you lobby your boss, it's going to make a difference? So in most companies, let's say you're vice president you're in the Boston office and you have 10 associates working for you, and there's a new job that opens up in your office. It's the vice president, the guy who's in charge of that, or woman who's in charge of that local office, who makes that decision. And so what are those 10 associates going to be doing all year round? They're going to be trying to suck up to that person and lobby that person and shoot down their neighbors to get that job. A few companies, Google is one example, McKinsey is another example, remove the manager from that decision. It's not your decision. And they fly in somebody from somewhere completely different, Sweden, who is chosen specifically because they don't know anybody everybody at that office. They fly them in and they do an investigation. At McKinsey, for example, it's called your investigator. And they interview up to a dozen or sometimes even more people to form a good view of whether this person merits this advancement. And then they fly back and they make a recommendation. In that situation, what are your incentives to go into your boss and lobby and suck up to him? Well, not very much. It's not his or her decision. What are your incentives to shoot down your neighbor's ideas? Well, not only is it not a good idea, it's a terrible idea because they're going to be interviewed about you. And if you're just shooting them down and stabbing them in the back, they're going to say pretty bad things and everybody will know it.
So give me another one. So obviously the way that you handle promotions and who is the judge and arbiter, I get it. That makes complete sense. How about in terms of financial incentives, in terms of thinking about what comp looks like? Like, would you have it more tied to that project? Is equity more important to some people and some efforts and less to others? Like, how do you, in terms of thinking about how people are compensated, what are the levers?
Absolutely. So if your compensation, you can think of what is the average growth rate as you go up in levels in the hierarchy. In most companies, it might be 15 or 25 or whatever. Imagine it was 500%. You go up by this incredible amount each time you go a level. Well, what are you going to focus on for that last hour of your day? Of course, you're going to focus on politics because there's an incredible reward from going up a level. Now, suppose it was 1%, that so much of your comp is tied to just the success of your project, but going up a level does nothing. Well, how does that affect your decision on spending that last hour of the day and politicking your boss or lobbying around? Nothing. There's no value in it to you because going up the level. So as you say, compensation growth rate up the hierarchy is one big factor that, again, tends to push you towards focusing more on project work, less on politics. Here's a third factor, span of control. So if your average manager has 3 people reporting to them, well, promotions that happen very frequently because there are only 3 people, and whenever there's a spot, it's going to be one of those 3. And so you're going to be in a pretty constant battle with your 2 neighbors to try to get that promotion. Now, suppose your manager has 100 people reporting to him. Well, promotions happen much, much more rarely. And now, rather than focus on trying to get promoted, which happens almost never, just incredibly rarely, you just focus on getting your project done. So what you see in some of the better R&D labs is they have these very large, very flat organizations, and it becomes more like a club. People are not worried about their level because there are very few levels. So it's not that one is the right answer or one is the wrong answer. If you want to try lots of ideas and have lots of things fail, if you're making, crazy new projects, then you want to have more like 20, 30, 40, 50 people reporting into one head. If you're manufacturing parachutes, if it's about on time, on budget, on spec, you want to have it much narrower because you actually want the quality control and the redundancy. So it isn't that one is good or one is bad. One is better suited towards taking risk and one is better suited towards reducing risk.
Well, first of all, I've gone skydiving once in my life. Now that I'm hearing this parachute analogy, I think I'm done with that because I don't want to, God forbid, I choose the company that doesn't have the right formula of driving the right incentives. Safi, I was thinking about industries that had gone through massive change. So bear with me for a minute here. So let's start with the smartphone market. At one point in time, BlackBerry came out of nowhere and they literally owned the market. I mean, pretty much everyone had a BlackBerry. And obviously it was there till it wasn't and just sort of, disappeared into oblivion. Apple comes out with the iPhone, but while there's been increasing competition, there's obviously all these Droid phones. 12, 13 years later, it's still a major player in the smartphone market. It didn't disappear. It didn't go to zero. It's still there. It's still thriving. Different example. Let's talk about the video rental business. We all know the story of how Netflix killed Blockbuster. But now we've evolved from the DVD to online streaming. Who dominates online streaming? Netflix. Now, granted, again, there's competition, but Netflix still has a very thriving business. So they clearly made the leap in technology transformation, as did Apple. They've stuck around and they're thriving. So if we look at that, would you say, well, Apple and Netflix must have much better incentive structure. Their structure, as you put it, must be better. All of these things we talk about, how the organization is set up and reporting relationships and all of these things, that's why they've survived. Like, is that the primary ingredient? Is that one of many? Are there other factors that you think drive for the companies that tend to be longstanding, healthy companies?
Well, I think the bigger picture question is, how do you balance the core and the new? The stuff about incentives is important to get right, and that's good if you want to create the right micro environment to nurture risk taking. You want to do those things correctly and in the group that's focused on the new, and you want to have different incentive systems for groups that are focused on the core. But the bigger picture is, how do you bridge that divide? Because that's where innovation fails. That's a kind of root source of failure. Most people think, it's in the supply of new ideas, but you put 10 people in a room with stacks of Post-its for an hour, and you're going to get 1,000 ideas, and some of them will be good. The failure point is almost always in that transfer between these sort of folks who are working on the new, the artists working on the new, and the soldiers working on the core, because they don't, the group making the money rarely likes the group spending the money, and vice versa. That's natural. And there's different jobs, different kinds of people, and they don't get along. When the CEO or leadership team leaves the room after saying we should all innovate and sing Kumbaya, they're not going to work together well because their incentives are totally different. And so you have to create the right systems internally to bridge that divide. And that's a problem for so many companies. We've had this 20th century organizational model for many years where invest, heavily in these great soldiers or salespeople who are focused on selling your product, and it's easy to measure what's their P&L, monthly P&L, and let's get the best salespeople we can. And let's invest in these great engineers who come up with these awesome products. Xerox PARC was an example of being excellent in both. It was the original, one-hit wonder company with the Xerox machine, and they do very well in creating these two environments. And that's what a lot of companies do when they do, let's set up an innovation lab, just like Xerox PARC did. And people get the lesson in that story wrong. Everybody knows the story. And they say, the leadership were idiots. And, in Xerox PARC, they develop all these great technologies and they never commercialized them. Well, who do you think created Xerox PARC? It was the leadership. They correctly saw that their product was going to get mature and they needed to stay ahead of that and develop the next thing. And so they set it up. The problem was that they didn't put in place the right systems to bridge that divide. One part was incentives. People were, being paid on selling typewriters. If you're a salesperson, every hour that you take trying to listen to some complicated new product from these engineers, you can't really understand what they're saying in their 97-page PowerPoint presentations. Every hour that you're trying to decipher that's 15 fewer sales calls, that's 8 fewer leads, that's 3 fewer sales. That's money out of your paycheck. So what's your incentive to try to understand that crazy new thing and try to sell it? It won't really take off for another couple of years. Well, you've got a paycheck at the end of this month based on your sales. So that's where so many of these companies fail. And this old model, this 20th century model of, hey, let's really invest in these great engineers or, these great scientists or creators or artists building the new in these innovation labs. And let's have these awesome engineers. And the bridge between them is like a high school kid with a clipboard. So there's a series of things that you want to do to help bridge that divide better. And you can think of it by analogy, let's say with a car. A car needs pistons, and of course it needs wheels, but without high quality oil, it's not going to run at high speeds. And so that old model may or may not have been okay for the 20th century, where the source of competitive advantage was more often hardware, a new tool or a new kind of product. But it's not going to be okay for the 21st century, where the source of advantage is shifting to software. And that's true for the military as well. Source of battlefield advantage for our last 100 years of wars has often been hardware, some new tool or technology. But for this century, it's going to shift to software. who's got the best AI algorithms, who's got the best machine learning algorithms. And our organizations are not well suited for that kind of rapid pace of innovation. Pace of innovation in software is much faster than in hardware. So the few companies that have done this well, I mean, you mentioned Netflix, Microsoft in the last 7, 8, 9 years has done this well. Google has done this pretty well. The companies that have done this well have a very different mind. One thing they have in common is a very different mindset of what it means to lead well. The old mindset is, oh, it's a great ruler who stands on top of a mountain and raises his or her staff and anoints the chosen project or the holy Loonshot, and whether it's the iPod or whatever. But that's, if you look back at the real histories, as opposed to these sort of fake revisionist histories, that's not what the truly great leaders have done. They lead much more like a gardener than a Moses. They see their job, their primary job, as managing the touch and balance between these two groups that generally don't understand each other and generally don't like each other. And they help take the early stage projects out of the sort of nursery, the Loonshot nursery, not too early, not too late, even because it's such a challenge. And then they take the feedback back to make, not too early, not too late. And they work on bridging that divide, that equilibrium, creating a dynamic equilibrium between these two groups. So they see their jobs, the truly successful leaders, the ones who are able to do both the core well and the new well, as bridging the divide between the artists and the soldiers, between the, those working on the new and those working on the core. And I think that's behind why some of these companies have succeeded, and at a high level, if there's one common pattern or thread, and others have really struggled.
You alluded to this earlier. You weren't entrepreneurs, or you could, I guess, make the case corporate entrepreneurs as well, to beware of the false fail, a false negative, so to speak, that most of these Loonshot products will die multiple deaths on their way to a significant market traction. So how do you know when it's just a speed bump or if you're truly hitting the wall? Because I assume it's only obvious in hindsight.
Yeah, so a false fail is you can think of as a flaw in the experiment rather than a flaw in the idea. And it's amazing when you look back over the course of the history, how many of the most important technologies and ideas were killed early on because of a flaw in the experiment. For example, the statin drugs, the cholesterol lowering drugs, which have had a cumulative roughly $1/3 trillion in sales and have saved tens of millions of lives. The first time the scientist had the idea for it and was working on it, well, all these cholesterol lowering diet trials came up negative, and most people said, oh, this thing could never work, and every cell in your body has cholesterol, so it must be a really bad idea. And then he persisted, and then he gave it to mice, which is the sort of standard laboratory test for a new drug, and it failed. And that would be the end. That was the end of that project in almost every company except this one guy who persisted in Japan, Akira Endo. And he eventually said, I wonder if there's something weird about mice. Maybe they just don't have enough cholesterol. And as it turns out, in hindsight, we know, we didn't know at the time, it's just a fluke that mice only have good cholesterol, HDL. They don't happen to have LDL, the bad cholesterol, and that's what statins do. So he persisted through some of these false fails. And the lesson there that matters is that the really big breakthroughs, they have these bumps. This whole fail fast and pivot stuff that's very popular in, let's say, Silicon Valley or other places. Well, that's good if you're doing kind of A/B quick testing. But if you want a really big breakthrough, like the statins were really a big breakthrough, they usually come with a lot of barriers in front of them. So how do you know? Well, you want to have a hypothesis. If you get a failure, if you just fail fast and pivot, well, you're probably not going to get past the first barrier like almost everyone else in your field. But you also don't want to, the pendulum to swing too far the other direction, which is stubbornness, where you're just dismissing negative results right out of hand. The middle path, which is, the best scientists and entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs that I've ever seen, their skill set was not so much in coming up with new ideas. Their skill set was in investigating failures. Because every new idea is going to fail and probably fail several times. And most people give up and say, okay, well, it failed. Let's move on. Like all those people that abandoned the statins. when it didn't work in mice. And Akira Endo kept going, in part because he said, well, let me try to understand why, because I see it's working here in the cell culture dish, but not there. I wonder if there's something about this species. And so then he met someone who worked with chickens and got him to try it and said, oh my God, it works fantastic in chickens, because it turns out they lay a lot of eggs and they have a lot of cholesterol, so it's easier to see. And that's true. It's true in the investing world. That almost everyone passed on Facebook the first time Zuckerberg went around to try to raise money in 2004, because all these social networks were failing. People were just leaving and jumping from one social network to another. At the time, it was Friendster. People were leaving Friendster. And there was one investor who said, well, everybody says they're really these bad business models. They're fads like jeans you can take on and off and everybody switches. But I kind of know that Friendster, why are they really leaving? Like, Friendster has a pretty bad website. It keeps crashing all the time. So let me see if I can get the user retention data. And he got the user retention data, and he found that despite this really bad website that kept crashing, that wasn't scaled to millions of users rather than thousands of users, people stayed on the website for hours. He said, could it really be a bad business model if people are staying on a website for hours? So he invested. He gave Zuckerberg $500,000, and he sold it 8 years later for $1 billion. So that was an example. It was a false fail of Friendster. It was a flaw in the experiment, not an underlying idea. So certainly one message is mind that false fail. The skill, if you want to succeed, is not so much in having a new idea. The skill you want to get really good at is investigating failure.
I think one of the most well-known examples of companies that fell asleep at the wheel, losing their way, was Polaroid. One time it was a huge success fueled by this innovation machine. And of course, we all know how the story ends, with their missing out on the digital revolution, eventually going under. But what's fascinating that you point out is the CEO, Edwin Land, was actually very aware of digital and its revolutionary potential. It wasn't like, his head was in the sand. He and his team simply chose to ignore it rather than embrace it. So what's the story behind that one?
Yeah, that's another example of a story that almost everybody gets wrong. And in part, that's because some of that history was hidden in classified documents. Edwin Land was kind of the inspiration for Steve Jobs. He married art and science in a beautiful way. And he was a genius level inventor. Several of his inventions that came out of his mind, he helped understand how the brain works. He helped, instant print was the technology behind instant print, which he created. Similar technologies have won the Nobel Prize. And then when he did, instant color print, he created essentially a new molecule to do that. He was a phenomenally talented inventor.
Yeah, way ahead of his time.
Way ahead of his time. And he happened to be a very good businessman with one fatal flaw. Now, the fatal flaw there was he was what I call kind of pay attention to your blind side. He was a product person. He loved technologies. And in fact, that was actually very much like Steve Jobs' early flaw, was he saw himself as this, what you might call a product type innovator, always about new technology, some new molecule or some new way of printing or some new kind of radar, or some bigger, faster computer or whatever. And if you look at the businesses who succeed and what ends up driving a lot of value, sometimes it's a new kind of product, but there's a different kind of loonshot or crazy idea that sometimes comes, and either you champion it and you're the hero, or you discover it when it's a bullet coming to your head and you're dead. And that's a small shift in strategy that involves no new kind of technology. As an example, when everybody tells you, hey, you want to open a retail store, let's do it where there's a lot of foot traffic in a big city. And so a young guy named Sam Walton ignores that advice and starts it off in the woods somewhere, far, far from any major city. And people are like, are you crazy? Who's going to buy what foot traffic? Are you going to get squirrels? Of course, that ends up, all his people who were telling him that are now out of business. And he has, the story created Walmart as the largest retail store in the world. So there are these subtle shifts in strategy that become incredibly important. The flaw there, the danger there is, if you're a product person and you see yourself as a product person, some new technology or new gadget's going to win the day, you will miss that second type of loonshot. So what people get wrong in the Polaroid story, the Edwin Land story, is he saw digital cameras before everybody. He was, as it turns out, advising the presidents on technology. And just certainly during the Second World War and well after the Second World War. And he got to see the discovery of the CCD chip in Bell Labs and understand that this would be a very important technology. And he recommended it to the president. This was before any of the Japanese companies or even Kodak, which gets, there was a scientist at Kodak who saw the potential of digital. This is well before Kodak. He was probably the first technologist who really understood digital cameras. And he recommended it to the president of the United States, which is why we got digital spy satellites, despite a lot of resistance. So he was a product person, but he was blind to that second type of loonshot, the S type, the strategy types. He didn't think about, is there another business model here? Because he said, well, there's no money in digital cameras because there's no film. And we make money by selling film. So forget it. And that actually is very similar to the early Steve Jobs when after Apple, and he decided to start more computer companies. He decided to start Next, and he built this faster, better computer. He said, oh, now I'm going to, I got kicked out of Apple. Now I'm going to come back with this, better product, and I'm going to show them. And that was a disaster because there was really no market for it. And then he's bought this, small company, this small group of engineers that were working for George Lucas and had helped him with Star Wars. And they had this computer called the Pixar image computer, the PIC, which was an even bigger, faster computer. So he said, this is great. I'm going to take this even bigger, faster computer, and then I'll show Apple. I'll have a better, faster product. It was priced at $100,000. And back then, that was really a lot of money. Of course, that was a total disaster. And he really resisted some subtle shifts in strategy. Even when people came up to him and said, hey, I don't think this product thing is going very well at Next or Pixar, but your operating system is actually pretty good. Your operating system is actually better than Windows, and people really need it. Why don't you sell your operating system to to IBM, which was really worried about the growing power of Microsoft? And he said, no, I'm a hardware guy. I make better products, and that's what I do. And so he turned them down. But in the end, the reason Apple acquired his company, they were the second choice when they were really headed down the toilet, is for the software, because they needed a new operating system. So he got rid of the hardware, shifted strategy, focused on selling software, and that's why he got back into Apple and came back 12 years later.
Yeah, I might argue that they were buying Steve Jobs as much as they were buying any underlying code in that company.
Well, you have to go back and remember that he was not who he was considered what he was today. He was considered there were famous quotes that he was kind of a business failure because all his company, the Next had died and Pixar had died, and they had tried 2 or 3, their operating system didn't work. And they had tried to buy Go, and they tried to buy other operating systems to try to plug that gap, and everything had failed. It was a Hail Mary play. And they bought that Next for their operating system, and that became the Apple operating system.
Interesting.
And there was a lot of tension because they didn't think they were getting Steve Jobs, because he wasn't who the current myth of Steve Jobs. He was this guy who had really struggled with his previous companies.
So Safi, when we talk about, some of the ingredients in helping to push companies in the right direction to realign incentives, most companies, have a chief executive officer, chief financial officer, chief marketing officer. You argue for a new C-suite role, which is a chief incentives officer. So what would that person do, and how would it be different from whatever comp specialists already exist within the HR function?
So if you were starting a company, almost every company has a chief technology officer, and their job is to get the best technology for a fixed budget. It's a strategic role. You're given a pie and do the best you can with that pie. Same thing with a chief revenue officer. You're given a marketing budget and get the highest revenue. But if you're starting a company, and I tell you, you could have a workforce with the best gadgets in your industry. Or I tell you could have a workforce that's the most motivated in your industry, the most aligned in your industry. Which would you rather have? Probably the most motivated workforce. So why do we have a chief technology officer who's making sure everyone has the best gadgets versus a chief incentives officer was given a fixed budget, and whether it's stock options or restricted stock or bonuses or cash, it's all the same. It's a budget. They're all part of a budget that you spend on employee. most companies have a pretty, they have 21st century, salespeople and 21st century engineers or designers or scientists, and they have kind of a 19th century compensation system. And I was certainly guilty of that when I was the CEO, because those are very difficult things. If I said they're very difficult discussions to have with people, who wants to say, if you have a choice between spending a couple hours on strategy or meeting with customers or meeting with your executive team and firing them up and solving a problem, or spending a couple hours on the details of incentive plans, which would you rather do? I mean, most people would rather do the former than the latter. It's not fun, but it's a possible competitive advantage. If everybody's got this sort of 19th century compensation system, and in the biomedical world, there's a standard industry, and almost all these sectors have a standard industry survey of, if this is your title, here's a typical range of salary. And so you meet with your HR function and you say, well, what's the typical range for this title and level? And okay, let's be, it's a good year, well, let's be at 60%. If it's an average year, let's be at 50%, and done. It's a 4-minute discussion. Now you can go back to customers and employees and strategy and board meetings and that sort of stuff. But if everybody's doing that, which doesn't really motivate people, well, for example, stock options. Oh, let's give everybody stock options. That's great. Well, when you're a 10-person company, that might make sense because what you're doing on could really move the stock. But if you're a 100,000-person company and you give someone deep in the middle a stock option that's tied to whatever earnings of your $50 billion a year company, and he's working on a small, a coffee machine design, what does that stock option do for him? Does it really motivate him or her on that project to work harder and get really excited and passionate? No, it's actually a wasted resource. If the stock company does well, it'll go up. And if it does poorly, it'll go down. Nothing to do with what he does. And that's called a free rider problem. So if you have someone at a much higher level who's playing a strategic role, tell me what the budget is, and I will redesign. Instead of wasting money on these stock options, I will create packages that are more tailored and more suited to what people really care about. I'm giving you a financial example,
Sure.
but the non-financial for many people is even more. Some people, everybody's motivated by different things, and that's totally fine.
But couldn't you make the argument that I think most people think they know what they want, but there may be a disconnect between what they think they want and then what actually ends up driving behavior?
Absolutely.
So this chief incentives officer, I assume if you just go take a survey, hey, what do you care about? What's most important to you? That may not truly lead to an optimized solution. So how does one go about figuring out, how do you optimize? Here's your budget. You've got cash and you've got equity. You've got bonuses based on it. Could be on your project, on a team, on a company, on a division. Just a myriad of ways you could do this. How does one go about, without just doing a bunch of, A/B testing and experimenting on people's, careers and livelihoods? How do you do that? How do you optimize?
That's exactly why you need a more sophisticated, a 21st century function rather than a 19th century. Because, what motivates Fred might be, he might have a mortgage and tuition, so he's really focused on the financial aspects. What motivates Tom, let's say, is a choice. If I do really well on this project, I get to choose my next project. That's more important to me than plus or minus X thousand dollars. Now, how do you tease that out? How do you surface that? Well, managers don't have time to sit down with each of their staff or each of their team and start to figure out what is really driving them. And it's not really their place. You want to focus on what you're doing. You want a much more professional, much more sophisticated chief incentive type of function who has not only the time and the bandwidth to really surface these kind of complicated, subtle things that you're talking about, whether Tom is motivated by choice or Tom is motivated by, for example, peer recognition. He doesn't care about a little bit of bonus, but if he or she could enter his design in a competition, a worldwide competition, going to work their butt off. So you want someone whose job it is as first priority, not as 10th priority, to tease out what will really motivate Tom versus Fred versus Mary versus Jane, and then help create a system that can meet that. So you want someone who has the tools and the skills that understands this latest thinking about nudges and how you motivate people and what really drives people, and has the time and the bandwidth and the energy to use that. And if you double how much you think about and understand on analyze alignment and incentives compared to what you do today, which is in most companies just like, all right, what's the title? Where are they? 50% done. If you double that, that becomes a strategic weapon rather than just like a back office function. So the point of this idea of having a chief incentive officer is let's weaponize this. Let's use this as a source of competitive advantage in surfacing how do we better motivate our people? How do we better align them with their jobs and with our goals? And you can use that as a competitive advantage in your industry where all other people are making sure everyone has the latest iPhone. You're making sure that your workforce is the most motivated and aligned. You're doing exactly what you just said, which is teasing out those differences that really drive behavior.
So you've done a ton of research for this book. Knowing what you know today, if you could go back in time and you're going to start that company, the biotech company, all over again, what would you do differently? Like, what have you learned through this project, through this book, that you would go back and say, I now see one or two critical mistakes. If I could alter, I might have had a different outcome.
Well, it's funny. If you ask, I think, any leader who is reasonably self-aware and reasonably honest, walk me through what you've done differently. It wouldn't be what you'd be like. How much time do you have?
Right.
Let me walk you through. I made so many mistakes. I got so many things wrong.
But specifically, though, from this body of work that you've done along the lines of incentive structures and what really motivates behavior and that sort of thing. Anything out of this particular journey that you would have applied differently?
We were a smaller company. In most biotech companies, until many years in their future, when the products succeed and they become giant, most of them are pretty small. So we had, the benefit of being relatively small at the time. And I think when I first started, I had an intuitive sense that there's different kind of jobs. There's work on something radically new, and then there's, minimize risk, on your core. But I don't think I really grasped that very well. And so I think I had an intuitive sense of, to be a good leader, you need to wear one hat when you're talking to biologists in the lab or chemists. You want to get really excited about what they're excited about, which is, here's a new idea and it's incredibly, and you want to ask. It doesn't mean that you're a backpatter and just I forgot what that word is when everything looks great, a Pollyanna. Mm-hmm. No. But you want to ask them the good questions that are the questions that they care about. Like, what happened when you tried this experiment? What are some other ways you might apply this? How does this tie into this other area of science? Because that really fires them up. And then you want to take off that sort of artist, creative, engineer, designer hat and put on your soldier hat when you turn around and talk to the person in charge of manufacturing or quality control. They don't really want to talk about what new ideas and how does this tie into this theoretical They want to talk about, hey, these were our quality metrics last month, and look what I've accomplished in the last 4 weeks. Look how fast I turned around this project, how we got the numbers down. And so you really want to get bilingual. You really want to get fluent in wearing the different hats and about probing people on the stuff that they care about. And I think that's one type of thing I would have done better. One of your earlier questions was, how did you learn? How did you go into something that's new? And, one thing is surround yourself with really great people and make sure you listen. But a second thing I did was, I was relatively young at the time, and I found every leader I could possibly find. I would knock on their door, and the question I would ask them was the one you just asked me. What do you wish you'd done differently? And I would ask from billionaires to, successful investors to successful operators. Anytime I'd be at any dinner or lunch or cocktail party and I could get even 5 minutes, that would be the only question. Because you don't really learn much from their successes. It's hard to tell if they were just lucky or in the right place at the right time. Often people are not very self-aware. Like I, made $1 billion because I was super genius. Actually, somebody told you to buy this thing and you bought this thing and who knew? But people are pretty self-aware about their mistakes. The smartest people I've met, the most successful, will wax eloquent. They just can't wait to talk about often, what they would have done. I mean, privately, probably not on public radio.
Sure. Oh, heck, I could spend all day. I could do a 24-hour podcast and talk about my mistakes. The final question I always end with, the name of the podcast is The Art of Excellence. How do you define the word? What does excellence mean to you?
Excellence, always striving to improve yourself and improve your performance.
Simple, concise, and speaks for itself. This has been honestly just really fascinating. And again, the book, Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. Bravo on the book and in this latest chapter, and really glad we got a chance to spend some time together.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Great questions and fun stories.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You can do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.